Sue was a young woman of 25 when she found herself a widow with a young daughter to raise. In the blink of the eye she had gone from a mother with a husband and daughter to a family of 2. There would no longer be the steadfast understanding of her husband to help guide her through life. The funeral and the changes in the life of Sue and her daughter Gina had been quick. Gina was now only 2 years old and Sue worried that Gina wouldn't even remember her father. But, now she had to make some decisions on how her life was to be in the future. It didn't matter how Don, the love of her life, had died. He had been killed while driving home from work. He had perhaps fallen asleep at the wheel on that fateful night, no one would ever know for sure. But now it was time to take charge and do what she thought would be good for her and Gina. Financially, Sue and Gina were set for the next couple of years. However, the money wouldn't last forever and she needed to make some moves quickly, and not wait for another day. The insurance had paid off her house and because of the work that he did she would be eligible for some money from his company for the first year. Widow benefits, however, were a joke and would not be enough to support her and Gina for long at all. Every day the young family sat in the large home that had once been a happy and carefree place. Every day it seemed that something reminded her of Dan and what could have been. It seemed as though Gina was being affected negatively also. Gina would cry for long periods of time and the glow that had always surrounded the little girl was dissipating right before her eyes. Gina made the decision to go back to work so that she and Gian would not be dependent on others for their well-being. She had always been a great outdoorsman and had her bachelor's degree on forestry and horticulture. So this is where she decided to start looking into a job involving one of the many national parks. Don and Sue had bought a home in a city due to his work and it was time for her to sell the home that had once been theirs and take the bold move to another state. As Sue went online and checked out the many opportunities that he skills offered, she finally found something that grabbed her attention. There was a chance for her to take a job in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. The towns that surrounded the local forestry were small and beautiful. There she and Gina could find the peace and tranquility that they both used. Another thing that drew her attention to the place was the educational system. There were several very well-known schools in the area and without a doubt would be very good for Gian. Putting the house on the market was a hard thing for Sue to do. She had always planned to live in that home for many years. She and Don had planned to have other children and it was sad to see one more dream come crashing down around her. Gina was looking at the brochures and ran into an ad for an old Cape-style home that would be 10 miles from where she would be working. There was a daycare center with high ratings nearby also. She decided to make a call to the realty office and listened intently to the man on the phone that told her of the many houses that were available in her price range. So off to Lanesboro, Ma Sue went. The ride from the Hartford airport was long but beautiful. As she pulled into the small town's center she found the real estate office and pulled into the parking lot next door. She looked at several homes, and then was driven to an old home on the edge of town. The house was in need of repairs, but something about it drew Sue to it. The home had a large front yard overlooking the hills where the scenery was eye-catching. Sue could only imagine how beautiful it would be during the fall foliage or the winter scenes. The home had 3 good-sized bedrooms, a bath and a HLF and a huge wrap-around porch. Even though she did not want to appear too interested, Sue wanted this house. As Gina laughed and ran from room to room, Sue felt even better when she saw Gina and her comfort while going into this new home. The papers were signed and although Sue's parents were somewhat worried about what their daughter was doing, they supported Sue and Gina and promised that they would be up to see them once they had settled in. The movers had brought everything into the house and now it was time to make the home touches that every home needs. Sue smiled as she hung the curtains, arranged the furniture the way she wanted it and was glad to see the dark and fell into a deep sleep that night. For 1 week Gina and Sue worked on making their house a home. They went to the daycare and met with the lady who would be taking care of Gina while her mom was at work. Gina seemed very happy with the new school and met a little girl that she took to right away. Things would be good, she hoped. But, the following Monday was to be Sue's first day at her new job. This was going to be an exciting chance to work in the field that she had always loved. Here in the Berkshires she would be responsible for much of the wildlife that she had always loved. That morning she left Gina off at daycare and began her life as a ranger in the forest. The land was wide and with so many trails without GPS, Sue found herself somewhat confused. She had done all of this in theory and had worked alongside of park rangers during her college years, but now she was an adult with the responsibilities that go along with that, and she was to make the best of it. This was going to be the time of my life, she thought to herself. For the first 2 weeks Sue would be working with a young man by the name of Dave. Dave had been working the Berkshires area for 5 years now and knew each and every tree ditch, homeless person camping out in the forest, you name it. Dave was about her age but had gone to work immediately after college. She enjoyed the time with him and met some of the people that she knew would be affecting her life. That evening while she was driving back home to pick up Gina, she saw a man on the side of the road. He seemed to be in distress as he walked over and over the guardrail on the side of the street. Sue decided to stop and ask him if he needed any of her help. The man was a very good-looking man with dark hair and blue eyes. He was tall and slender and spoke with a slight southern accent. "No, I am fine, but thank you for stopping. I am gathering berries," and with that he showed her the can that he was carrying. It was nearly filled to the brim with fresh blueberries. Sue smiled as he offered her some. She loved blueberries and accepted the offer with grace. She smiled to herself as she wondered where the strange man lived. There were so many hidden places in the wide open spaces that one could now love, and with that she went on her way back home. The house was finally beginning to take shape, and with all the painting and wallpapering done, Sue was now working on updating her kitchen. It was a massive task, as it appeared as the home hadn't been updated in years. Gina loved her new daycare and had made a few friends. She was excited to go to school, and life was finally starting to pick up for the small family that had suffered such a tragic loss. Every day as Sue made her way home, she would see the man that she now knew as Mike on the side of the road doing something. He was always busy and sometimes just gave her a wave as she drove by. Once in a while Sue would stop and talk to him. He was very interesting to her, and so this night she thought that she might take the opportunity to offer Mike a good meal. She was a good cook and she thought she might want to get to know this man a little better. But Mike was kind as he turned down her offer. It was clear that he did not want to go to Sue and Gina's home, at least not at this time. "You see, madam, I stay here on the side of the road because it is not too far from my home. I am a private person and enjoy the independence." Sue smiled and thought how strange it was that every time she saw Mke she would see him in almost the exact spot. He always seemed to be carrying a pail but doing nothing really proud. Chapter 2. The house was busy, for the first Christmas was in the air. This would be Sue and Gina's first time without Dawn, but she wanted to make the best of it. Mom and Dad were coming over too. She had missed them and it was going to be great to see them again. The house had the smell of Christmas and she had cut down her own tree just the other day. Gina was excited like most 3-year-olds were. She was growing up so fast. There was a gentle snow falling on the Monday before Christmas and Gina smiled as she removed the snow off of her windshield. Gina was running through the flakes laughing. She dropped Gina off early and headed out to her job. It was to be a busy day, with the holidays, the snow and everything going on. As she made the mountain towards the ranger station she went by the place where Mike was always, although usually at night. As Sue turned the corner she found the road to be void of any snow. As a matter of fact it looked as though she was driving through the summer weather. Oh, and she couldn't believe that the work crews had managed to destroy the road. Oh, they had been warned that there was going to be some major construction in that location in the coming months, but now in the middle of the winter? She wondered what the state was thinking. Without warning her SUV stalled and now to top off everything else she was stuck on the side of the road on her way to work and she was going to need a tow. She got out of her car and checked everything under the hood that she could and couldn't find anything wrong. Everything seemed to be in working order, but the car wouldn't run. She was just about to pick up her phone when she heard a noise. As she turned around she saw a house that she had never noticed before. Outside was a man chopping wood. As Sue made her way towards the man she found herself surprised. It was Mike. She smiled at the man who put down his axe and walked towards her. He smiled and introduced himself as Mike Sullivan. You could have knocked Sue over with a feather. This was Mike Sullivan, the man that she had met so many times. How was it that he didn't even know her? But she was going to try to act naturally. She raised her hand to shake his and smiled friendly to him. I am so sorry to bother you, but my car stalled just down the street and I am afraid that I am going to need a tow. Mike smiled down at the lady who had come into his yard. He had lived alone most of his adult life and it wasn't very often that people stopped by. His house was way out in the hills of the Berkshires and he enjoyed the privacy and peacefulness that surrounded him. I am sorry but I have not gotten any of the modern conveniences such as a phone out here in the woods. I am not sure what a car is but if you take me to your vehicle I will attempt to see if I can get it moving once more. This took Sue back. What was he talking about new inventions? Mike invited her into his home and she was struck with how old-fashioned everything was. He had no running water or electricity. The house smelled differently too. It was a home, but like a home from another time. As the two friends made their way towards her car she once more noticed how handsome Mke was. He was so tall and slender, with a muscular build. He walked with ease towards the car, even though the growths in the forest were hard to climb over. They walked to the spot where the car was and just as Sue was about to remark on the fact that she was surprised not to see the car, the scenery changed once more. There was her car and the road was now paved. She shook her head and turned to speak to Mike but he wasn't there. Just her car and the way things had been just a little more than a half an hour ago. Sue was visibly shaken as she pulled into the ranger station and tried once more to get her bearings and take a couple of deep breaths. What had happened to her was something that had absolutely no explanation. Mike had not known her and she was sure that the house that he had welcomed her into when the weather got a little bit nicer she was going to make her way back to the house. She needed to know who Mike was and what had happened on that fateful night. Chapter 3. As Sue got into the truck with Dave, who had become her partner, for now, she thought about all the things that he knew about the history of the area. She thought for a few minutes and then he turned to her and said, "A penny for your thoughts." Dave looked down at Sue and wondered what was going on this morning. She appeared to be in another world. She had been almost a half an hour late also. Sue was never late and he wondered what could have happened. Sue smiled and said, "Do you know the hill that I take to get back to my home? I know that you know just about everyone in the area. Well, I have met a man named Mike Sullivan. He lives in a small cabin just a short distance from the road. Do you know anything about him?" Dave was surprised to hear Sue talking about the man named Mike Sullivan. He knew the story of Mike Sullivan really well and knew where the ruins of where his cabin had once stood just about 100 years ago. But, he cleared his throat and tried to act casual. "How did you meet Mike?" Sue smiled at him and said, "No, we just met when he was picking blueberries on the side of the road. He was polite and we have spoken several times." The stories in the hills of Mike had been heard by everyone in the area at one time or another. He had even seen a hint of smoke coming from the of the old cabin that had once been Mike's home, but Dave was a man of logic and had always discounted those stories. He smiled down at Sue and said, "You know what? We are in the area of his old home. I can take you there right now." Sue was so intrigued by the offer that she eagerly agreed to going on the trip. As they pulled up to almost the exact spot that she always saw Mike, she looked around. But, Mike was not there. Dave got out of the truck and headed towards the spot where the cabin had once stood. Sue looked around the deep woods and smiled. The woods looked somewhat different but she recognized what looked like the path that she and Mike had taken just a short while ago. As the two friends walked up to the ruins of the cabin, Sue saw that things still looked the same as they once had. As they turned the corner that Sue had just traveled an hour ago, the house was a pile of wood. There was nothing left the home that she had been in. Now she was really in shock. What had happened on that snowy morning? Where had she gone? How did she see Mike this summer? Dave looked around the area and watched Sue from a distance. She seemed to be confused but turned to him and said, "What happened here?" The story Dave was about to tell her was unbelievable. Why did Sue want to know about something that had happened so long ago? But, the story was interesting and Dave took a seat on the old log that lay on the ground and told her to take a seat. Chapter 4. Mike was an outdoorsman who lived here in the area for about 20 years. He made himself a nice home and spent most of his time taking care of his property. He came into town once in a while and was well liked by the people in town. The year was 1879 and there was no such thing as weather warnings. The weather had been very hot on that day and Mike had been outside picking blueberries when without warning. The day was July 16. Pittsfield was hit the hardest and it took days for anyone to notice that Mike Sullivan hadn't been seen in a while. On August 3 a couple of the townspeople made it to Mike's home and found him pinned under the remains of his home. He had died that hot July day and he still had the pail of blueberries in his hand. The stories of people seeing him have been constant through the years and this part of the forest is considered to be very haunted. At first they thought that it had been as a result of the tornado, but they found a bullet hole in his back. Someone had shot Mike in the back. As Sue listened to Dave's story, it was unbelievable, poor Mike. But, what was going on? She had talked to Mike, spent time with him. He had not known who she was because what she saw had not happened yet. Now she wanted to go back and meet the man again. Could she travel through time once more, she wondered? She took a big gulp of air and asked, did they ever find out who the murderer was? Dave shook his head and said, no, whoever did it has passed through time. No one was ever charged. There is a lot of information in the local paper. It was the biggest story in town for years. Then when the ghost stories started, it became a famous campfire story. Even as a kid I heard the stories too. I never saw him, but there are people like you that say they have. Walking around the area, Sue could not imagine the horror that had happened to that kind man 150 years ago. The 150th anniversary would be coming up on the 16th of July in just over 6 months, and she made a pact with herself to solve the murder by that time. She felt that she owed this to her friend. That evening as she drove home she watched for Mike, but he was nowhere to be seen. The road was covered with snow and it was now getting a little slippery. As she headed to pick up Gina, she stopped by the library and grabbed a couple of articles that were abounding in an old ledger that the librarian proudly showed her. As Sue did the dishes she thought of the man that she had met and the tragedy that had bestowed him. Who would have wanted him dead? And to shoot him in the back? Is he haunting because he wants his murderer caught, she wondered? She didn't know for sure, but she knew that she needed to find out what had happened. But the holidays were there and her parents were on their way to her new home and she would have little time to do much investigating on Mike. The home was wonderful and her parents were great. Sue had not realized just how much Gina had missed them. 2 days after Christmas they took Gina down to the outlet mall just a few miles away. This was going to give Sue the first chance that she had had to go over the many papers that she had found on the Mike murder. As she read the pages the years seemed to melt away. Mike was a well-known man and had lived a quiet and uneventful life for the most part, but someone had murdered him in cold blood. She found the picture of his cabin. He was outside with an axe in his hand. It was definitely the man that Sue had met on that eventful day. Just what had happened? She was busy looking at the papers when she heard a knock on the door. It was a carrier carrying a package. Sue tipped the young man and went into the living room where she opened the box. Inside the box was a dress from earlier times. Something told her that it was something she needed to put on right away. Sue picked up the dress and went up to her room to change. As she put on the dress that had belonged to the past, she felt a shift in the air. Something definitely changed, and as she looked out the window she knew that she had fallen into another time. The light switch by the door was gone and there were candles in the sconces. She then heard a knock on the door and opened it to find Mike standing there. He was so handsome that Sue found herself staring at him. Oh, he was gorgeous. With this she welcomed him into the home. How was she to explain that she didn't even know the house? She had just arrived herself, but she welcomed him into the kitchen. She was surprised to find out how different things were arranged. There was no running water, no refrigerator, just the old stove that still remained in the kitchen. She walked over to the stove and started up the coffee pot. The two sat down and started to talk. Sue was mesmerized by this charming man who was from another time. Here she sat in the kitchen of a house she would not occupy for another 150 years, and it seemed as though she was in the right space and time. Confused and mesmerized were two little words that meant so much to her and Mike's situation. The two friends took a walk down the path in the front of her home. The road was unpaved and the homes that dotted the street during Sue's time were gone, but the beauty still remained. She fit right in wearing the dress that she had put on in the year 2020. She held a parasol and smiled and shook her head as they passed the people on the street. Mike seemed to be a popular person, one that fit right in with the current residents. Oh, how was this happening? Sue wondered to herself. The afternoon was turning into evening and Sue knew that she had to leave to her own time. She had a daughter and a life, but she was falling madly in love with this man Mike, and if nothing else she was going to solve his murder and save him from the eternity that he was facing haunting the road of his old home. Mike kissed her gently as Sue walked back into the home of old and went upstairs. There she took off the dress and put on her own clothes. Within moments she heard the sound of her parents' car, and as she walked down the stairs she gave her daughter a big hug. It seemed so strange that she was now in her own time. She could go from one time to the other with the ease that most people could do when they walked from room to room. Somehow or another she had been given a gift and she was going to make sure that she made the best of it. Dave had been waiting for Sue to come to the car and watched her intently as she walked towards him. It was forbidden that he told her who he was unless it was the only way to save a dangerous situation. Oh, the things that had happened in the past, they were all entwined and he was there to help Sue fix things. Had it really been only a few short months ago that he and Sue had been married with a little girl named Gina? He had thought that they had been happy, but when he had gone to the place of judgment he had found that Gina, Sue and Mike were all entwined in human history, and that if the situation was not corrected during this lifetime each one of their should were going to be damned to wander worthlessly forever on the plough that is between life and death. Mike had already been there for 150 years and Dave was on his way to the same fate. Sue was the only hope that the five of them had, that they would have a blissful eternity. He had to save their souls at all costs. The dress that he had given her had once belonged to Sue in her other life, and that dress would be a part of the solution, Dave hoped more than anything. Sue got into the truck and began her long day at work. She had more questions about Mike and the history and hoped that Dave would know more. But, unfortunately he didn't know much more, and anything that he did know he was forbidden to tell her. But, he offered to help her go through some of the old information from the library and the newspapers from that time. So that evening Dave came over and started going through the hundreds of photos. He was watching Gina, who was getting so big and curious too. Gina had at one time been the adult when it came to the past. Sometimes spirits stay in the between worlds longer than others. Dave did not understand why this was, but knew that it was in fact a fact. Sue was going through the photos when she was stopped by the sudden onlook upon an old photo of the woman who had once lived in the home that she now lived in. It was her. Oh, her hair was different and she had a much more stern look, but it was her. She could not deny that. She sat and stared at the photo for several seconds and then handed the picture to Dave. Dave knew that this moment was sure to come, and he still did not know how to address her question. Yes, he could see that the woman in the picture from so long ago was a dead ringer for Sue, but he was going to address her questions as well. Everyone has someone that looks like them. It is said that everyone has a double. He told her. Dave, I think that I have been given the gift of time travel to correct a wrong that once happened to Mike. Somehow the lady in the photo and I are entwined in time. Something lets me know that I am the key to correcting this rift in time. Dave smiled at her and gave her a quick hug. Sue stepped back in kind of a shock. Not only had Dave never made such a move, but for an instant she was sure that it was her husband who had taken her in his arms. She shook the feeling off and tried to act as though there was nothing different. But Dave knew that if he wanted to be successful in his mission he could never do that again. It was getting late and Dave went home. Sue thought of putting on the dress, but knew that she was too tired to do anything at this time anyways. Every day Sue spent the evening going over every article that she could find dealing with Mike, the town, the people in the town, and her home at the time. She found out that lady who had lived in her home and Mike were a couple. It was thought that someday they would marry. If it hadn't been for Sue's mother they might have married, but her mother was against Sue even speaking to Mike. Mike had been confused by the happenings of the day before. Sue had been very kind, ladylike, and a joy to be with. It was not that she was not a good woman, it was that he never knew which Sue he was going to meet. And her mother, just because he was Irish she thought that he was not God enough for her daughter. He was going to have to end the relationship and he just did not know how to do it. Chapter 5. Sue had gone through every picture and every article that she had found 3 to 5 times and knew that it was now time for her to go back to the old time once again. She had a few vacations day due, and so that morning she called out saying that she would be back by Wednesday. She dropped Gina off at daycare and then headed back home to get back into her dress. As she descended the stairs of her home of old, she knew that once more she had stepped back into time. She looked around, put on a bonnet and headed out to town. Not thinking that a woman during that time was not supposed to go out without an escort, she drew the attention of the townspeople as she walked down the street. Fortunately for Sue, Mike came out of the hardware store and greeted her with a smile. As they walked down the street together, she felt the safety of his being. They walked together until they came to his home. It was a small hut but clean and well kept. She took a seat at the table and smiled at her friend. Mike didn't understand the woman with whom he was now talking with. She was smart, well-mannered, and seemed to be a little lost in his home. Sue had been there several times, but today she had asked him a strange question. She had asked him where the bathroom was. Mike had heard of a bathroom, but living here in the woods, well, the bathroom was outside. She seemed a little taken aback by his answer. Sue should have not asked such a question. She had almost given herself away. Now Mike knew that something was different about her, but, other than that, Sue had a wonderful first day with him and wished that every day would be like that from now on. As Sue came into her home, she was met by an older lady that she recognized as the lady that had been identified in the photos that she had collected as the Lady Sue from the time before Mother. She was not happy with Sue and had the look on her face that left no doubt that her mother was not happy with where she had been all afternoon. "So you have been with that Irish man again? Well, I sure hope that you kept yourself honorable. After all, you know better than going to a man's home and not bringing a chaperone. People will talk in town and they will have good reason. If this continues, I will be forced to put you in a sanitarium where they will take care of you." This was the last thing that Sue wanted to deal with. This is what she had heard about. If a woman did something that her family did not approve of, they would send her away. Sometimes women would remain in these places for the rest of their lives. She had to be careful, or she would do something that could cost the lady that belonged in this time a life-changing event. "Mom, nothing happened. Mike has always been a man of honor," she pleaded. With this, Sue went upstairs and changed back to her old clothes. She was pleasantly not surprised to find herself back in the time that she was sure she now belonged in. Gina was sitting at the kitchen table with her mother and father, and they smiled as she entered the room. But something had changed this time. She had left Gina at daycare and her parents had been on their way home after their visit. Why were they still there? It was then that she looked at the calendar and it was Sunday all over again. She now was going to have to listen to the conversation to make sure that nothing else had changed. But the morning chatter was almost word for word as it had been just the day before. Since Sue had already been in the past, she did not need to take any time off for work. She headed to work and found Dave already sitting in his car. Once again, just for a moment, she thought that the man in the truck was her dead husband. But that couldn't be, could it? She wondered. However, she was traveling back and forth in time, perhaps anything was possible. Dave could feel his past coming back and forth. He had been warned that sometimes people were more capable of sensing things, and he was wondering if Sue knew who he really was, or at least suspected it. This was something that he would have to watch with extreme zealous. As Dave and Sue went around the area doing their job, Sue found Dave quiet. He was not usually very talkative, but today he was very quiet. They went by the spot that Mike had been seen, but alas, he was not there today. Somehow or another, Sue had to find out who had murdered Mike. Was it that mean woman who called herself Mom a stranger, or who? Once again she went over the articles from the old newspapers. Finding nothing, she went upstairs and once more put on the dress. But as she was getting ready to get into the dress, a thought crossed her mind. She was not sure why the thought had never crossed her mind before, but who had given her the dress? Perhaps that would give her some insight into how she is able to go back in time. The courier, she thought. So she called the Western Union and found out that the package was given anonymously and there was no record of who sent it. Undeterred, Sue asked if anyone remembered anything about the person who had ordered it. Yes, a lady said she remembered the young man well. He was a tall, dark park ranger. Dave, she gulped. Who was this man, Dave? The next morning Sue got into the truck with Dave once more, and after just a few miles she asked him to pull over. "Dave, I know that you are the one that gave me the dress. That dress is not only very old but something happens whenever I put the dress on. How did you find it and why did you give it to me? Dave knew that sooner or later Sue would find out that he was the one that gave her the dress and now he had to come somewhat clean. He could only tell her just enough to satisfy her, but from that point on it was going to be up to her. Okay, I will tell you what I can. Dave cleared his throat and said, I am here to help you save Mike if possible. Mike is caught between planes and without the help of you will be left in between for as long as eternity. This is all I can tell you. But, it is within you to correct the wrong that happened too long ago. Well, that was it, she was on her own. Knowing that she was the one that was going to have to save the day, she headed home early and went upstairs and put on the dress. Right away once more she found herself in the other time. As she came down the stairs she looked at the calendar. It was the day that Mike was murdered and a cyclone would hit the town. And the time was soon. Sue was about to leave when she was confronted by her mother. What are you doing here, you ungrateful daughter? I just saw you walking towards Mike's house. As Sue tried to back her, the woman grabbed her. But Sue knew that she had to get to MK's house and she just went by her, shrugging her off. Sue was at a dead run now. It was not an easy task as it was now raining hail and the shoes and dress were slowing her down. But she was a woman on a mission and she knew that she had to save Mike. As she came around the corner she saw Mike. He was arguing with her of all people. Sue saw herself holding the gun. There she let out a yelp, the lady turned around and Sue went to grab her. What happened next was unexplainable, she and the other woman became one and the fun was never fired. The next moment was just the worst moment of Sue's life. She heard the quick snap of the branch and saw Mike go down. He was dead. Dead? How could that be? She had traveled through time to save his life. She had stopped herself from killing him and yet he was still dead. Sue ran into the town to find people running around in terror. Most of the main street was in ruins and she had a hard time finding someone to come and save Mike. But, to her sadness, Mike had passed on. As Sue went to her home she climbed the stairs and got into her clothes. Sue was devastated but she had her daughter Gina would live to the best she promised herself. That morning as Sue arrived at work she looked at the truck expecting to find Dave, but the driver was Mike. And the journey continues.